I started my 3D printed R2-D2 project more than a year ago, and to be quite honest, I didn't really expect it to take this long. The dome only took a couple of months to finish, and it turned out better than I had expected. As you can see, it's made up of a number of pieces that are fit together, but then when you use body filler and paint and primer and so forth, they come out pretty seamless. But when I started on the body, I had some issues. Now, I originally printed this frame that's supposed to go underneath the body, but my printer at the time did not have a heated bed and had a tendency to warp when I was printing flat pieces like the ones that made up this frame. So you can see here, there are two pieces that make up this one piece, and they're not quite flush together, and that means that everything is sort of thrown off. So in order to get things together, I had to kind of use a Dremel and just force them into place. In the end, I did come up with something that looks sort of like the frame is supposed to, but I was never completely satisfied with it. So I decided to go with a completely different body. Not that one. I took a break for the winter, and by the time I was ready to start work again, the designer had come out with a much improved second version, which you see here, so I decided to just scrap the earlier one and go with this new body. It's made up of a lot of little pieces, as you can see here, that you assemble together, but there's no sort of inner frame and outer skin arrangement, which I think is a much better design overall. So I started printing all of the pieces, and I'll have to say these new versions are a big improvement, and they're really well designed as well. They're oriented in such a way that they don't require supports in most cases. So like this piece, believe it or not, required no support at all. And overall, it was not that hard to print all of the pieces and start assembling them, although I did run into some problems with warping, as we'll talk about later. It was greatly improved from when I was doing the frame, however. So as you can see here, we have sort of a bottom layer and then a top layer that I've already assembled. And you just put them together. Obviously, you'd put some glue on there too. I'm just doing a test fit here. Speaking of glue, in my previous video, I talked about how I was using epoxy glue for most of this. And I actually discovered that Bob Smith Industries makes a really good super glue that works extremely well with PLA plastic, as long as you rough up both surfaces that you're gluing together. I found it to be basically as strong as epoxy and a lot easier to use, so I used that for the majority of this. I've misplaced the footage that I actually took of this, but when I was assembling the body, I found that even though the warping that I mentioned earlier, I managed to get much lower than it had been, I found that when I was going around the body and assembling it, that it kind of accumulated and made it so that the last piece or two just wouldn't fit. There was about a 1/4 of an inch extra, so I ended up having to just cut that off with the Dremel. It also meant that moving pieces like the doors here, and the hatches, and the utility arms, which should be able to move, and sort of would still, even in my completed version, I didn't feel were going to be working well enough for me to leave them that way, because they would just not fit together properly once everything was painted. It would look kind of bad, I thought. So I decided to just glue everything in place. One of the things that took me so long making this body is you have all of these individual panels, of course, that are joined together, and you need to glue them together and also cover up the joins where they come together, the seams, with body filler or some kind of spot putty. But also you have to worry about the texture of the 3D print going through there. You can sort of see it in the reflection where there's a rough texture to it, and that's not really what you want on R2. You want it to be smooth like painted metal. In making my life-sized Kenner action figure weapons, which I've done in other videos, I discovered that Bondo spot putty, which you can see here, actually works really well and is pretty easy to use for filling in gaps and covering seams and so forth. So I decided to use it on a scale which I have never tried before, which is basically all over R2's body. Now, I started by putting it fairly thickly in places where I needed to cover actual cracks, but I also gave it a thin layer on almost all of the entire body. The idea was that the putty would go into the grooves of the 3D print lines and make the surface a lot smoother. With the dome, I just sort of brute forced it and started sanding bare PLA until it was quite smooth, and then I went ahead and primed it and painted it and so forth. But it just took forever, and it was a lot of work. Of course, there are also products like XTC 3D, which I've heard of. I was afraid, though, that it would be too difficult to control because it's a liquid and it would go down into the cracks and things like this, whereas the putty is a lot more controllable. And once it was dry, I went over it with sandpaper to try and smooth it out. And if I needed to, I would go back and apply some more just to fill it in and make sure the surface was nice and smooth. And after a while, it really didn't take all that long, I got a relatively smooth surface. And I did this for basically the entire body, as you can see here. And it's a little difficult to tell because of the coloration, but it's actually quite smooth to the touch. The next step was applying some filler primer. That helps fill in any minor imperfections in the surface and also lets you see more clearly where you need to sand more. So yes, there's definitely still some sanding involved in this method, but it's way easier than trying to sand sort of bare PLA down to a smooth surface, which is what I was trying with the dome. Here we have a sort of in-between stage where you can see that it's starting to come together, but it's still got some rough spots. But like this top panel here is looking pretty smooth, even though it's made up of 3 separate pieces, as you saw earlier. And here it is again, after another sanding. I was really starting to think that this method might work for me, which was good because I was kind of all in on it at this point. But I wasn't entirely sure until I started actually putting the white paint on whether it was a success or not. So I did 1 layer of putty and then sanded that, and then I primed it, sanded it, primed it again, sanded it again, and of course it did little touch-ups and things in between as well. But that's about the main process. Here I am putting the first coat of white paint on. This is Rust-Oleum Satin White paint, which was recommended by the R2-D2 Builders Club. Since this paint has a satin finish rather than a glossy one like you probably want for R2, I went over it with a couple of layers of crystal clear enamel as well. I'm not totally sure why they didn't just go with a glossy paint to begin with, but I didn't want to change it and maybe get the color of white wrong, so that's what I went with. I think one of my biggest problems when it comes to painting things with spray paint anyway is that I always go too thick. I know that they're supposed to be sort of very light coats, then you do several coats and build it up gradually, but I always end up putting too much on. And in this case, I did end up getting some runs because of it. Luckily, I discovered that if you take some fine-grained sandpaper, at least with this paint, you're able to sand it down, and it looks pretty good. And then I just did another light coat of paint on top of that, and you can't tell it was there at all. So I kind of lucked out on that score. There's really only 3 colors you need to worry about for the body. Of course, we have white, and then silver for the metal parts, and also blue. However, I'm starting out here by taking some of the pieces that I've sanded and primed and filled with filler putty as necessary, and painting them black so that I can use it as an undercoat for silver. It seems to make the metallic paints really look a lot better. After those were dry, I went ahead and did the silver. This is just a bright metallic silver from Rust-Oleum, and it looks really good actually. Looks quite metallic. Here I am doing some of the blue pieces. This is the same Sonic Blue Pearl from Duplicolor that I used for the dome. Several of these pieces are not actually supposed to be blue, but the reason I'm painting them here is that parts of them are supposed to be blue, and what I'm going to do is paint the entire piece and then mask off the parts that I want to remain blue, and then go over the top of it with silver. So I cut some pieces of painter's tape to the right width, and then put them inside the grooves to cover up the parts that I wanted to remain blue. Then I went over the top of it with silver. I debated whether I should actually paint it black again like I did with the other pieces, but it turned out that the dark blue was more than good enough. After it was mostly dry, but not completely dry, I used an X-Acto knife to remove the tape, and it came out pretty well actually. It's difficult to be super precise with this tape, given the conditions here, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So there was one more step for all of these silver pieces that I went through. You can see it's kind of maybe overly bright and seems kind of like silver paint, so I put some black paint on top of it to kind of weather it and make it seem a little bit more natural looking. Before it had a chance to dry, I just wiped it off with a paper towel, and it looked pretty good, I think. This does kind of tone down the shininess of the paint a bit and makes it look not quite as metallic, but I think overall it looks really good. I do occasionally make mistakes, though, believe it or not. Here's one of them. I decided that the best way to paint this particular piece, which is the coin slots, was to first paint it blue and then spray some silver on a piece of cardboard and dip it into the silver, because just the ends of the coin slots there need to be silver. I think this method is sound, but I just used way too much paint, as you can see here. And so what happened was that after I dipped it in the paint, it looked like it was going to work fine, but then it started running pretty badly because there was just too much paint on it. So I had to go in and touch this up with a brush. I'll have to say it was very satisfying to be able to finally put some of these pieces together once I had them all finished and painted, and then, of course, to actually put them on R2. At the same time, there was kind of an element of just wanting to be done with this project, and I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, but in some cases it kind of allowed me to accept that things would be maybe not entirely perfect. But if you look at R2-D2 in the original trilogy in particular, he is just a mess, and I don't just mean the weathering that they went through. He can change quite a bit from shot to shot. There'll be parts that are like missing or broken or not properly installed, or just various things that, if you look closely, are kind of shocking. So I guess you could argue that having some defects, at least minor ones, is actually screen accurate. The blue here looks almost black in the terrible lighting in my garage, but it is blue. I will say that I think I got the blue color on the body a little bit darker than it needs to be compared to the blue on the dome, but it's relatively close. There. Now I'm affixing the utility arms here, and I was a little worried when I was installing parts like this about whether they would fit after all of the paint and everything had been applied, and it was pretty close. There was no way I was going to be able to make these utility arms go in and out as they were originally intended. It's just the way it was. Here you can see the coin slots are all fixed and looking pretty good and blurry. So those just go in from the opposite side there. The model includes a lot of brace pieces and things that you can attach to sort of stabilize things. I didn't include any of those, actually, at least not yet, because I'm just gluing these things in with epoxy glue, and mine is not going to be a moving droid, so it really doesn't need to be super sturdy. It just needs to sit there. Installing these pieces was a little bit nerve-wracking because I just was afraid I was going to screw something up or get epoxy glue all over everything, and that stuff really doesn't come off very easily. So it was a little bit tricky, but it came out fine, actually. In a couple of places the fit was too tight and ended up scratching the paint, so what I did was to take some of the original paint and just spray it on a piece of cardboard and use a brush to touch it up. And I'll have to say this actually worked better than I had expected. I was a little afraid that it would be obvious, and it actually covered it up almost completely. Now, I am going to be going back and weathering this once I get the entire body done, but I thought I wanted to start with a nice white undercoat if I could. And here we have the finished body, and I'll have to say it's amazing how well this turned out, especially if you consider all of the kind of trials and tribulations that I went through trying to get everything to fit together. You can see inside here where all of the different panels come together. You can see it looks kind of rough in places, of course, but none of this will be visible normally when we have R2's dome on. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and put that dome on top. And I'll be darned if this isn't R2-D2. It's a pretty incredible feeling to make something like this from scratch. I'm not really the most handy person in the world, and I haven't done any kind of large-scale projects like this in the past, but it came out really well, better than I had expected. If you look closely, you can still see some defects and some of the 3D print lines that have remained because I was just, well, frankly, a little too lazy to go in and sand everything, but I'm really pleased with how it turned out. As I mentioned, I'm going to be weathering this eventually, so that'll go a long way toward covering up a lot of the defects that might exist. But in terms of the surface of the body itself, I think it looks really good, and it's quite smooth. You can't tell that there are joins anywhere for the most part, and you definitely wouldn't, I think that this was 3D printed unless you knew ahead of time. One small addition I did make on my own is this restraining bolt that I designed myself. Unfortunately, I ended up apparently putting the panel on upside down. It has a magnet inside the panel that I put there, and one on the restraining bolt, but it sits a little bit low, unfortunately. This has definitely been a big learning experience for me, and I've still got quite a bit to learn because I have to figure out how to assemble and attach the legs and make them stand up on them and so forth. But that's going to have to wait until next year, I think, because it's already getting quite cold here, and I just don't think there's enough time left to finish everything before it gets too cold to paint. If you're thinking about making your own R2-D2, well, first of all, be aware that it is a time-consuming process, but it's a pretty rewarding one as well. You can go to Mr. Baddeley's Patreon page. He's the designer of this model, and you don't actually have to pay anything or become a patron to get to the designs, but if you do pay like $1 or more a month, you can sort of interact with him a little bit, and I would definitely recommend it to anyone who's actually thinking about making their own R2-D2 this way. I'll put a link to that in the description below. So I'm going to be moving on to some maybe smaller scale projects now and come back to this project in the spring. Thanks very much for watching.